Almighty and everlasting God, give unto us the increase of grace, faith, and hope and charity, that we may obtain the things you promise. Cause us to love the things you love and the things you command. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Verse 3 of hymn 104, yet he shall be forsaken and yielded up to die. The sky shall groan and darken, and every stone shall cry. Every stone shall cry. For stony hearts of men, God's blood upon the spearhood. God's love refused again. Yet we turn our attention to Bernard of Clairvaux. It's Reverend Eales' work. Bernard, Abbot, Clairvaux, kind of toward the eastern central part of France. Allegedly, he's buried at Clairvaux. Calvin quotes him favorably at times. I don't know where he stood on some of the hallmark doctrines of consistent theism, but was a godly man. Published by the Society for the Promoting of Christian Literature, 1890. Excuse me. The authorities for this is a notice for the life of Saint Bernard are his Latin works. A bunch of contemporary biographies are listed. Several French works here. English work. It's giving a bibliography. Contents: the state of Western Europe before the time of Saint Bernard and his parents. The Cistercian order, which was a sort of a revivalist or a renewal movement in the Benedictine order. More strict monastic professions, early experiences. Bernard is an abbot, reform movement among the higher clergy. Disputed papal succession in Italy. But I thought it was so united, that one church. The conflict of Bernard with Peter Abelard. Apparently, Bernard tried to challenge Abelard on his exaltation of human reason and theology. I'm not sure where that went. The preaching of the Second Crusade, the latter days and death of Bernard. Life and Times, Chapter 1, State of Western Europe before St. Bernard. Fall of the Western Empire, lapse of the nations into ignorance. Defeat of the Moors at Tours by Charles Martel. That's 722. Rise of Pepin. His school's causes of renewed declension and death, secularization of the dignities of the church, appropriation by the nobility, counts, bishops, and count abbots, relaxation of discipline, simony, degradation of the papacy, Renaissance causes for this, the Völkerwanderung, the wandering of the nations, the First Crusade, Norman Reformation, Lafranc. And I'd like to do a little bit of work on Lafranc. He's a French archbishop who went over, or abbot who went over to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. When the Roman Empire in the West broke up at the length before the repeated attacks of the barbarians, the result was a condition of disorder which continually grew worse and worse as the lifeblood died out of the organization of government. The case was not one of one empire defeated by another, which then succeeds to its inheritance, but of an empire overwhelmed by barbaric force, succeeded by the reign of chaos and old night. It was in 476 that the West Empire was finally extinguished by Odoacer, Odoacer, and the lapse into semi-barbarianism in Gaul, Spain, the Rhinelands, and the British Islands was immediate, rapid, and steady. In a little more than a century, we reached the period which the historians Fleury, Guizot, and Hallam are agreed in regarding as that of the lowest depth of ignorance to which the European mind has sunk in historic times, the 7th century, the first of the Dark Ages. This lasted for a while, and then the tide of barbarism began to recede. Charles Martel ruled back in 732 the host of Saracens who had penetrated into the very heart of France in a great battle between Tours and Poitiers. I think I'm saying that right. In which it is asserted that 300 Mohammedans were slain. Pepin, deposing the last of the Merovingian sovereigns, refounded a Western empire. The Frankish custom of a partition among the children of the deceased sovereign of all his dominions, which neither Pepin himself nor his immediate successors dared to disregard, retarded the growth of this new empire. And it was not until Charlemagne, as Karl came afterwards to be called, had been for some years the ruler of a part of the dominions of the deceased father Pepin, but the death of his brother Carolum in 772 united the whole under his scepter. He was crowned as the Emperor of the West on Christmas Day, 800 AD. But the extraordinary genius and untiring activity of Charles multiplied many times the effect of his reign. The constant wars, which were then the normal condition of a sovereign's life, did not indeed advantage much either religion or culture. Though Charles extended his empire over the whole of Lower Germany, up to and beyond the Elbe, it occupied him 30 years to complete the subjugation of the warlike Saxons who occupied those countries. At its greatest extension, his empire included all the territory west of the Elbe, the Saale, the mountains of Bohemia, and a line drawn southwards from thence, crossing the river Danube above Vienna, extending to the Gulf of Istria. He held the greater part of Italy, almost as far as Naples, and Spain up to the Ebro. But the Emperor Charles was not a mere conqueror. Wherever his victorious armies passed, came also the imperial officers to organize and administer the affairs of the newly added province. He reformed coinage, established weights, measures, and standards of value, strove during a long series of events to construct a legislative system founded on Roman civil law, but incorporating Frankish elements. Footnote: his exact title was Carolus I Caesar Augustus. The emperor, then ruling at Constantinople, Nicephorus I, soon after sent an embassy to him acknowledging him as Emperor of the West. As might be workable through the realm, he attempted to create a navy and even had under consideration the plan of providing an internal line of communication between the opposite ends of his empire by canals uniting the Rhine and Danube, a magnificent conception for his time. This was the secular side of his prodigious activity. Still more was remarkable the ecclesiastical side. One of his first cares after subduing a territory was to mark it out in dioceses, to found monasteries, to erect churches for the Christianization of the people. His methods of proselytizing were indeed those of his day. The Saxons, the Frisians, the Bavarians, the Avars, the Bohemians, whom he defeated, were forced to submit to baptism under the penalty of death. Even his favorite minister, Alcuin, blamed his haste and imperiousness in forcing baptism under penalty. More worthy of unmixed approval are his love for learned men and his care to encourage learning. Almost all the scholars of his time were encouraged by his invitation and favor to settle at his court. No other such distinguished subjects as Angilbert, Agobard, Pascasius, Rodbertus, Rabanus, Morris, John Scotus, Erigena, and Hincmar. These taught not only theology, but grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, classical literature, and canon law. Under their guidance, he founded schools in his own palace and elsewhere, which were the universities of his day, and surrounded learning and learned men with many privileges and immunities. His schools furnished the pattern for others when the Renaissance came, which we propose to describe. The schools established in cathedrals and monasteries taught, for the most part, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the trivium, in addition to theology. The lay schools or colleges added to this preliminary course the 4 divisions of mathematics, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy, which were called quadrivium, quasi quadruplex via ad sapientium. Those who were pursuing the first course were known as trivialis, and those who went on to the more advanced course were the quadrivialis. Thus, Ducange quotes an epitaph upon Hugo, a physician and teacher in the medical school of Paris. Quadrivium docuit, octotum scire reliquit, anno millennio bis centum, sed minus uno. The works of Aristotle, or at all events the logic, were read in the translations out of the Arabic. Philosophical works appear to have been translated by Michael Scott in 1230 as claiming to teach the entire circle of human knowledge, omne scibile, or as a name describing the whole body of members. Such schools were at length styled universities. The school or faculty of law in Pavia dates from the 10th century. That of Bologna existed as early as 1158. The next instance, that of Paris, was not formally recognized until 1209, though it existed some time before. The academic titles, degrees of bachelor, master, and doctor in each faculty were granted and were held in high estimation. A doctor in either faculty was considered to be of equal dignity with a knight. Disputes for precedence between holders of these 2 ranks are known to have been settled by conferring on the former the dignity of knighthood. It was even held that a doctor in civil law actually lecturing in it. Yes, the footnote is down at the next page. The revival of learning was, however, but of brief duration. The great emperor died in 1814. His dominions were divided according to the usual custom of the Franks between his son and his grandson, and the mighty fabric of his empire began at once to fall asunder. The schools which he had founded were not really called for by the spontaneous desire of the people. It had been imposed upon them from above. They were 200 years before their time, and as soon as they were left to the action of law of supply and demand, they began to decay. Charlemagne had been but 15 years dead when the French bishops assembled in synod at Paris, appealed to his successor, Louis le Debonair, to avert the impending ruin of the educational system set up by his father. Quote, "We earnestly and humbly petition your highness," they say, "that you, following the example of your father, will cause public schools to be established in at least 3 fitting places of your realm, that the labor of your father and yourself may not, through neglect, which God forbid, utterly decay and perish. So the benefit and honor of God, bound to God's holy church, and to your great reward and everlasting remembrance." Close quote. The empire of Charlemagne had kept large masses of men continually in movement. The emperor was continually traversing his dominions from one side to the other. With him traveled also, of necessity, his escort, his suite of imperial officers, and the numerous attendants upon these. Large masses of soldiers were continually feeding the line of combatants on the eastern frontier of the empire. Couriers going to and fro, provincial governors proceeding to their duties or returning from them. There were caravans of merchants from the ports on the Rhone and the Garonne, and who'd made their way across the Alps from Italy, or through the Pyrenean passes from Spain, with their ladings of gold and gems, spices and fine fabrics from the east, silks and muslins, I-N, I don't know what that is, not Muslims, muslins, from Arabia or Egypt, drugs from the Levant, the famous red leather from Cordova, or sword blades from Damascus. The emperor was not always fighting with the Mohammedans or Moors. He had peaceful relations with Caliph Harun, and is said that a Saracen emir, Solomon al-Arabi, with many noble companions, were present in Charles' camp at Paderborn in the year 777, when the defeated Saxons were forced to be baptized or die. Life was busy, stirring and adventuring during the reign of Charles, and men's minds, no less than their daily life, were stirred for a time into activity, but the impulsion given by his powerful mind. He seems to have been restored for the moment the august unity of the Roman Empire. But when he was dead and his dominions divided, Western Europe was broken into separate communities, and the sense of its homogeneousness speedily died away. The roads became no longer safe, and the habit of international travel almost ceased for several centuries. Even between different districts of the same realm, communications was difficult and sometimes dangerous, and that in summer, the roads being beset with bands of robbers, whilst in winter there being, properly speaking, no roads, that ceased almost entirely. Neither was communication by sea either easier or more safe. Even the attempt of the emperor to create a navy proved a failure. The seas were swept during this period by piratical barks of the Normans and other Vikings who would have captured any peaceful trader and put its crew to the sword. Their continual inroads upon the seacoasts of France obliged numbers of the peaceful inhabitants to desert their homes and take refuge in the interior of the country. Commerce was thus paralyzed, and ignorance grew on more and more. The church suffered from this equally with the state, besides having become perverted by causes of injury peculiar to itself. In the first place, it had become very rich, especially in France and Germany, though neither while the Roman Empire stood nor after the various kingdoms of Europe had carved out of its fragments did the church ever receive any territorial endowment from the state. Yet the voluntary munificence of sovereigns and great nobles, as well as persons in more private stations, abundantly supplied the need. The French kings of the first dynasty, the Carlings, especially Charlemagne, and the emperors of the Saxon line set up hardly any bounds to their liberality to ecclesiastical objects. The bishoprics and other dignified posts, thus richly endowed with large estates, were universally sought by the nobles as a suitable provision for their sons, and were frequently conferred not merely upon those sons who had not reached the canonical age for holy orders, but even upon mere children. Got a footnote. In the course of time, the nobles came to look upon the dignities of the church as belonging to themselves by a kind of right, and to be indignant if any of them were conferred upon persons who were not of noble birth. They seemed to regard the high-born clergy as forming, as it were, a separate caste in the church, who had a right to all the more important ecclesiastical fiefs. Louis Pius in this, as in some respects, was far from meeting the wishes of his nobles. One of his biographers, Thegan, comments upon the fact. It was the great weakness of Louis that he did not prevent the worst of usages by which the base as slaves, and we'll pick it up later. Okay, so we're down here. In one case, a child of 5 years was made coadjutor Archbishop of Reims, cum jure successionis, and another see of Narbonne was purchased for one of 10. It was frequent to have bishops under 20 years of age, and even a pope, Benedict IX, was raised to the papal dignity when he was but a boy of 12 years. And then the footnote continues. He followed the fatal example of Jeroboam, who made the lowest of the people priests in the high places. No sooner have such men attained elevation that they throw off their meekness and humility, give loose to their passions, become quarrelsome, evil-speaking, ruling men's mind by alternate menaces and flatteries. The first object is to raise their families from their servile condition. To some give good education, others they contrive to marry into noble families. But Thegan was himself one of those highly born dignitaries whose monopoly was interfered with. St. Bernard writes upon this the tract on the office and duty of bishops. At the present time, people only look at the splendor of dignities and not at the responsibility which is attached to them. A man blushes to be only a simple minister in the Church of God and believes himself to be of no account, to even be dishonored, if he's not raised to some eminent post, no matter what it is. Do we not see children who have but just left school, and youths who have barely reached manhood raised, because of their noble blood, to the dignities of the church, passing from under the government of the feudal to exercise government over presbyters? Back to the text. Such highly born prelates usually remained essentially secular in their occupations and habits, maintaining the state of princes or nobles, and devoting themselves to secular affairs. In spite of the prohibitions of canon law against the bearing of arms by clergymen, they wore armor, led their vassals to the field, and charged at their head in battle. The military talents of Hubert Walter, Bishop of Salisbury, and afterwards Archbishop of Canterbury, were displayed in the Third Crusade and afterwards in his own country. The chronicler Geoffrey de Vidsoff, who describes this crusade, declares that during the siege of Acre, there were killed or died of disease 6 archbishops and patriarchs, 12 bishops, and a vast number of priests, which shows the great number of men of that function in the army. And Matthew Paris relates that Richard I, having captured in fight Count Philip, who was Bishop of Beauvois, threw him into prison, whereupon the Pope demanded his release as a churchman. And Richard sent him the blood-stained coat of mail, which the bishop was wearing when taken, with the ironical comment, "Know now whether it be thy son's coat or not." It was not surprising that prelates whose own hands were far from clean and who had absorbed in the secular occupations of the time should exercise no effectual discipline over the clergy, and should have not at all times be scrupulous as to the learning or other qualifications of those whom they admitted to holy orders. St. Bernard accuses them roundly in a letter to Pope Innocent, saying, "The insolence of the clergy occasioned by the negligence of bishops is everywhere the cause of the trouble and disorders in the church. The bishops give holy things to dogs and cast pearls before swine. And then those creatures turn upon them and trample them underfoot. That is the just punishment of the prelates who tolerate the disorders of their clergy, who go fat upon the goods of the church and never correct the disorders. These well merit to be tormented by those whom they bear with, showing a culpable indolence toward them. When the clergy are enriched from the labors of others and suck the richness of the earth without making the least return for it, they grow corrupt into the very bosom of plenty, so that in order to describe them, we need only say with the prophet, they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Exodus 32. And here we will draw a picture of the impact of the secularization of the bishops. Very useful coming out here in practical theology, church history over here. And we want to do good historical work, but we don't want to cut off the appendage of practical theology. Remember, it's my bishop who said to me, I don't talk theology. Verse 4 of hymn 104. But now, as at the ending, the low is lifted high, the stars shall bend their voices, and every stone shall cry, and every stone shall cry in praises of the child by whose descent among the worlds are reconciled. That's a bit loose. 20th century. Just cross it out. Worthless phrase. Godspeed.